after the 2008 financial crisis, this is very personally, I felt that journalists were blamed oftentimes. People were upset with the journalists. They said that we did not blow the whistle loud enough. And by default, since the crisis happened, perhaps we didn't. And I would suggest if you go back and look at all the writings, I think we're trying to blow the whistle pretty loudly, but people didn't want to focus on that whistle. And it's true when the music, Chuck Prince, who ran Citigroup, used to say, when the music's playing, you have to dance. And I think that's part of the problem. I found more recently, the more I have been cautionary, the more I've received feedback from readers and viewers and the like, that it's almost paternalistic. And they say, stop trying to protect me, Andrew. And by the way, they say, you're not trying to protect me, you're really protecting the man by sort of being almost paternalistic about these things. So I don't know.
Co-host of Squawk Box on CNBC, founder and editor of the New York Times' Dealbook newsletter and financial news service, Andrew Ross Sorkin knows a great deal more about finance and investing than he lets on there. One of the financial world's preeminent journalists, authors, and even screenwriters. His best-selling book, Too Big to Fail, about the 2008 financial crisis, was turned into an acclaimed film. He also co-created the TV series Billions, starring Damian Lewis and Paul Giamatti. More recently, Sorkin went all the way back to the Great Depression, with a new book exploring the characters behind the world's biggest financial crisis and the lessons it holds for today. His new book on that era, called 1929, was the subject of our big interview. Andrew Ross Sorkin, welcome to the big interview. Thank you for coming, first of all.
Thank you for having me, first of all.
Andrew, I wanted to start with maybe one difference between your first book, Too Big to Fail, and this one, because what has always struck me, at least, about the Great Depression is that it's mostly a story of private financial individuals and business leaders. They're the ones who made the mess, but they're also the ones cleaning it up. That's very unlike the 2008 crisis, which was basically led by Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, a government bailout, as your Too Big to Fail book outlines. How did that difference play out in writing 1929?
The truth is, actually, it was not that different. In fact, I think that Too Big to Fail was quite instructive for me to actually think through what characters were doing and oftentimes feeling in those moments. So back in 1929, obviously, I couldn't go interview these people. So I was going through their diaries and memos and letters and transcripts and depositions and all sorts of archival material so I could try to recreate these moments. But everything, if you see a quote in this book, it's a real quote. If you see somebody having a thought, it's because the thought was documented somewhere. But having covered that crisis of 2008 and able to interview and talk to the sort of prime players in that moment, you got to understand the psychology of what happens in a crisis. So I actually think I was able to sort of try to apply that and map that in terms of how I approached my research, the kinds of things I was looking for, the kinds of connections I was trying to make, recognizing that in certain moments, people of that ilk invariably do certain things. And so that sort of gave me a little bit of a head start. But the truth is that I would say that the type of people that were in charge back then in the late 20s were very similar to actually the people in 2008. And by the way, quite similar to the people in 2025, both in terms of the bankers and the elite that ran the country, frankly, and the same people effectively trying to save the system afterwards. I mean, the engagement between the business class and the political class is remarkable. I mean, I can't tell you that these bankers were sitting in the Oval Office constantly with Hoover and then Roosevelt in the same way that they're sitting in the Oval Office today with Trump in many ways.
Just tell me more about that process, because as you say, the other biggest difference in writing these two books is the fact that with the 2008 book, you could interview the people. In this case, you had to go back into all of this archival footage. How did you approach that? What was different about it? You're trying to paint a picture in your own mind through reading all of this instead of getting a real sense of who these people are by speaking to them in person.
Well, so I had read a whole number of books about this period of time, and most of them were written by economists. They talked about sort of the systems and economic cycles that led to 1929. The book that I was searching for was this character-driven in-the-room narrative, something like Too Big to Fail. And I think because I couldn't find that exact book that I wanted, I went off to try to do this myself. It just so happened early on in this project, even before the project began. I happened to be giving a lecture at Harvard. I got there early, and I had some time to burn. And so I walked into Baker Library and asked the librarian if I could look through some boxes of a guy named Thomas Lamont, who becomes a major character in this book. He was running J.P. Morgan at the time, and his family had donated his archives to the library. And I opened up the boxes, and maybe third folder in, I see that his secretary had been keeping transcripts of his conversations with Roosevelt in the Oval Office, and that there were these letters back and forth between him and Hoover, and you could just see it. And it was just plain as day that if you could put that on his feet, wow, that would really bring you in the room. Now, so I went back to the librarian, the archivist, and I explained to her who I was and what I wanted to do. And she said, Andrew, I'm sorry, this book that you're talking about is impossible. There's a lot of material here on Thomas Lamont. You are going to be very challenged to find the kind of granular material you're looking for other characters in your book. And that's one of the reasons nobody's written such a book. Of course,
you accepted the challenge.
I took that as a personal challenge. And she was not wrong in that there is not one or two or three or four sort of archives that you could go mine, the way I think a lot of historians sort of find a sort of a mother lode and they really just excavate. This was like putting puzzle pieces together, disparate puzzles from all over the country, all over the globe, going to different libraries and museums and finding documents and letters and things from different families to really be able to sort of get you to that place. And in fact, oftentimes, the main character in the book, Charlie Mitchell, does not have an archive of any sort. Citigroup, where he worked, has an archivist. They have very little material of his own writings. But what I did get was I got the New York Federal Reserve to give me the board minutes from that period. They'd never been disclosed before. And it turned into a treasure map for me in a way, because all of a sudden I knew where Charlie Mitchell was at any moment and the people that were around him. And so then I would go search their archives, and I would search the archives of their friends, people that they had corresponded with. And so you would find in some cases sort of third derivative letters where people were going back and forth about how they had just had a meeting with Charlie Mitchell and this is what was said at the meeting. So it was a little bit of a needle in a haystack scenario. And for many years, I would sort of go through these sort of ups and downs of being very excited and then being terribly depressed that I didn't have the material that I was looking for.
You mentioned the minutes, and I want to get to that. But before that, you also mentioned Charles Mitchell. And it is interesting that he is kind of the protagonist of this story, because you did also mention J.P. Morgan. Mm-hmm. J.P. Morgan tends to be the one that one focuses on more. That
Typically.
Story has been told more often. What made you decide that Charles Mitchell was your character as the CEO of National Citibank, City Company, Citigroup as it's now become? What made you decide he was – there's a point where you mentioned that he was a caricature at the time. What
Right.
made you decide he should be your focus?
Because it was clear to me, even reading the newspapers back then, that he was the most important banker in America. National City was the largest bank in America and was going through a transaction, a merger, that would have made it the largest bank in the world. And for reasons that are somewhat inexplicable, history seemed to completely erase his role in everything that happened. He is largely responsible for inventing or popularizing the idea of lending money to people so that they could go buy stock. I mean, that was an invention of the 1920s. Prior to 1919, it was a moral sin to take a loan. I mean, this was not what proper people did. And he was somebody who really, popularized that idea, really led to, brokerage firms emerging on the corners of streets all over New York and the rest of the country, and frankly in other parts of the world. That's what he did. His name, they called him Sunshine Charlie. And in fact, it was once I really understood his role and then understood the role of somebody else who's a main character in this book who also seemed to be erased largely from history, which was a guy named Carter Glass. Carter Glass was a senator in Virginia who was really like the almost Elizabeth Warren of his time. And for many years, he would rail about this thing called Mitchellism and how he believed that Mitchellism and Wall Street were going to upend the country and society because of the speculation that they were fueling. And I think once I recognized both his role, meaning Charlie Mitchell's role, and Carter's role, and these two egos that were almost pitted against each other in this sort of years-long war, I thought to myself, ooh, that can be the spine of a real narrative.
You've got yourself a story.
Yeah.
You do also look, though, at business leaders, and you just mentioned the role that Charlie Mitchell plays in credit, but it goes back further as well. You talk about the GMs of this world, the General Motors of this world, who started this process of offering people loans in order to buy cars, and sort of where that started and moves into stocks, as you say. When you looked at all of these business leaders that feature in the book, did you get the sense, the impression that they knew what they were doing? Do you feel like they understood the potential consequences at the time?
I think that because this was a first for all of them, they probably didn't fully appreciate the true risks involved. You know, one of the main characters in the book is a guy named John Raskob. You referred to what happened with General Motors. He was the person at General Motors who created this idea of how are we going to sell more cars? We're going to lend people money so they can buy our cars. And he, in some ways, is almost like the Elon Musk of today. I mean, he ultimately gets involved in politics. He builds the Empire State Building. To me, somewhat responsible for the reason we have a 5-day work week today. I mean, he was sort of a philosopher king. I don't think that they fundamentally appreciated all of the risks involved, nor, I oftentimes think about the amount of manipulation that was going on in the market. Insider trading was rampant. There were these things called investment pools that today we would look at and say this is clearly illegal and unethical and immoral. But I try to put myself in their shoes, and back then there were no laws. There was no SEC. There was no insider trading laws. There was none of this. And so when you think about it, and it's an interesting thing about the stock market itself and trading. Trading has always been about people who think that they are outwitting the other person, right? Whoever's buying a stock invariably has to think that they are smarter than the person selling them the stock. And whoever's selling the stock has to think that they are smarter in that moment than the person buying the stock. And so if you kind of try to put yourself back in their shoes in that moment, in that period of time, I think a lot of them thought, even when they were involved in these investment pools and pump and dump schemes and other things to manipulate the stock, that it was just another form of outwitting the other side, really.
And then the Federal Reserve Bank of New York finds itself in the middle of all of this. And this is where I did just want to bring in briefly the minutes and the fact that you even uncovered these, because I was amazed, frankly, to find out that they hadn't been released, that this was something from so long ago. And we're not talking about the JFK assassination here. Like, why were these minutes not out before? And what did you learn that surprised you from it?
Well, I'll tell you what's even crazier about the story. So I went to them, asked them for the minutes. For maybe 2 years, I don't think I got any. Then they, I think, told me that they were going to give me the minutes, but that a lawyer had to go through the minutes, and they sent me a redacted version of the minutes. Literally, someone had blacked out sentences and pages of the minutes. Of course, then I went back to them and said, this is insane.
This is like CIA. I mean,
and what's under the black? I want to know what's under what's being redacted here. They finally did give me all of it. And the truth was, virtually none of the stuff that had been redacted was shocking or would shock your conscience or was some kind of great secret. I think what had happened in truth was back then they had told all of the board members that everything that was being spoken about and discussed was demonstrably confidential. And that they were trying to hold to that line even today.
After they've all passed, they've all moved on.
Today you can get the minutes, I think, from maybe 1950 or 1960 on. They're very available. I think they post all of them online, in fact. But for whatever reason, prior to that, they had not.
It's so interesting that, so one other aspect of this, to get a little broader, we tend to think of 1929, I guess, in public consciousness, maybe even on Wall Street, you can tell me, but as like the original crisis. Although, actually, of course, it wasn't. There had been bank runs before that, and there's a moment in the book where you describe even Charlie Mitchell's memory of his own 1907.
1920, 21. We can go back all the way to the tulips if you like, but yes, we've had this before.
Is that part of the reason why you see in writing this book parallels to today? Because on the one hand, yes, the Great Depression was the first big one, but actually it was still, like we talk about today, it was a crisis where people kind of knew something about crises. They knew what could happen if all of this went wrong.
I think this was the first crisis of true scale that enveloped the ordinary investor. I mean, I think that was the biggest distinction, that the ordinary investor, by the way, in the United States, in parts of Europe, the UK, had become obsessed with the stock market, become a pastime. Trading had become a pastime. So I think that is a major distinction between what was actually happening in 2007 or even 1920 or prior to that. And because it was such a large and long depression, I think there's more attention on it. I also think there's so many myths about it. I think most people in their head, at least I know for myself, thought that there was one bad day. People talk about Black Thursday. Sometimes people talk about Black Tuesday. I know other people who talk about Black Monday. Well, the truth is there was all of those and more. And so I think understanding sort of what that crash even looked like, and then the fact that it wasn't the crash unto itself that led to the Great Depression on its own. It really was the first domino in a series of dominoes of ultimately bad choices, including bad policy choices. So I was trying to take you in the room in Washington with the politicians and inside the White House to see the mistakes that were made on the backside of the crisis. Everything from Hoover's trying to raise taxes at the worst possible time. He's implementing, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs because he was trying to get farmers to vote for him in 1928 and promised them he would implement tariffs and felt that he needed to make good on his pledge. You had the Federal Reserve sitting on its hands debating the gold standard and whether they could get off the gold standard to actually push money into the system. So all of these things and all of these issues we live with today, I think that's the big piece of it, which is in one way or another, you will see elements of 1929 in today because the truth is so much of today was born in the 1920s.
So much of it was born in the 1920s. One other thing that interests me is when you talk about the government response, the chaotic response, but also afterwards the efforts to clean it up. Obviously, after 1929, Washington is aware of Wall Street. They now know they need to be involved. They need to watch this in a way that maybe they didn't before. But I'm curious, again, from who you write about and the human stories here, the other side, the Wall Street people that you look at, the business leaders, were they aware? Was there a grudging recognition on their side, at least after that crisis, that they needed the government or somebody else to kind of save them from themselves?
That's such a good question. I don't know if they ultimately believed that. Interestingly, for what it's worth, Charlie Mitchell, who had been really at loggerheads with this guy Carter Glass for years and years and years and thought that this Glass-Steagall bill, which effectively broke up the banks, the creation of Charlie Mitchell unto itself, he testified years later that he believed that it was a good bill. Now, what I've never known was, did he say that to placate the politicians or the press in that moment? And did he believe what he was saying? Or did he genuinely believe it? And this was a statement. Years after the 2008 financial crisis, interestingly, Sandy Weil said that he thought it was smart to have broken up some of the banks, which I thought was sort of a shocking statement, given that he had built the modern Citigroup up in the way that he did.
Which again also shows that we all have short memories, I suppose, which is the other thing that I wanted to ask about, which does, of course, bring us to today. You mentioned Glass-Steagall following the Great Depression. Dodd-Frank was the regulation bill that happened after 2008. It does feel like each time we get to the point of a crisis, we then have regulation to solve it. And then we start to roll back those regulations once again, potentially leading to the next crisis, which is, I guess the question then for me is, why do you feel, with the two books that you've written at this point, why doesn't Wall Street itself continue to clamor for more regulation that would suit them and protect them from some of the worst outcomes that we see happen?
It's not in human nature. Did you ever see the movie? Did you ever see the movie Wall Street 2? It's not nearly as good as Wall Street 1.
I did a long time ago. Okay. I'm trying to remember Wall Street 2 at this point. Wall Street, you're right, is the first one. There's a scene
with Shia LaBeouf in it, talking to, I think, Josh Brolin, where Shia LaBeouf says to Josh Brolin, "What's your number?" I don't know if you remember this. And he's asking, what's your number? As in, what's the number that you need to achieve in your head to reach, financial independence, to basically stop? What does getting to the top of the mountain mean for you? What's your number?
What's your number?
Sorry? Oh, we'd start you at 300 like everybody else. I mean, as a partner, I only pull in 600, and the bonus is...
No. Your number.
More.
And he looks at him and he says, more. That's the answer he provides, more. And I think that answer is instructive of the way I think a lot of people on Wall Street feel. And frankly, I think the way a lot of people feel in truth, which is that we are always after the lottery ticket. I mean, I think that one of the things that happened actually in the 1920s that we live with today is a sort of shift in even what the American dream is or was. At one point, that dream was, the sort of rags to riches kind of, Horatio Alger dream. And I think in the 1920s, and I think that the dream you see on Instagram and TikTok today is a sort of get-rich-quick scheme. And I think everybody wants their chance at the ticket. The problem with getting the lottery ticket is that most people lose.
Or you get the lottery ticket and then you lose all the money once you've had the lottery.
Well, that's true, too.
Is there, in that sense, you mentioned this with stockbrokers, though, is part of this also a failure almost to believe that another crisis can happen? Or is it something else, like more of a hubris in thinking that even if there is a crisis, I'm going to be the one who's able to ride that wave back?
Well, I will flip it around on myself and just say that here, I will counter my own argument about more or the lottery ticket, because there's one other piece to that, and it doesn't fit the narrative. Because the truth is that if you look over the last 100 years, it has been much more profitable to be a professional optimist than a professional skeptic or Cassandra. It just has. In fact, by the way, there's a sort of a fun moment in the book where Winston Churchill shows up in New York. He's actually there during the crash, which is shocking. But after the crash, and he had lost some money, he got bitten by the bug too of stock trading. He talks about the idea of this sort of American optimism. And it's true that speculation, you do need some sense of speculation in the system to create any great innovation. Whoever was investing in Tesla at the beginning, when it seemed like a completely absurd idea, needed to be a speculator. And so you want some kind of speculation. So the question is, is a bubble and the fact that it's going to burst a feature or a bug of this capitalistic system? I question it. I don't know, because I do.
At this point, it has to feel like a feature, no?
I think it is, but you do want, you're trying to thread this sort of very complicated needle, right, where you're trying to create a system that has some semblance of speculation, but not too much speculation. And how do you find the balance?
Which does bring us right to today, because I know you've talked about this before. You have said you believe that another bubble is coming.
Even how could it not be?
Exactly. How could it not be? Given our history, it's impossible to believe there won't be. But is there something different about this time, about AI, the businesses that are leading that effort? Or do you watch all of what's happening now and just think to yourself, we're in the same sort of boom and bust cycle as all?
No, I don't think it's completely the same. The truth is, look, there's leverage is the leverage, meaning the loans, the debt, the credit in the system. That is the match that lights the fire of a financial crisis, always. So when you look at the euphoria around AI, the question is how much leverage is in the system? How much, what are consumers doing? Buy now, pay later. How many loans are being taken out to support the ecosystem that's being built of all of these data centers and the like?
Speaking of, just in your Dealbook newsletter today, $38 billion OpenAI deal with Amazon. Does that count?
And every single day. Every single day. Extraordinary amounts of money are being spent. But that's actually real money. The thing, and you referred to actually Dodd-Frank, and this is an interesting thing that I have been thinking about more recently. So there's part of me that likes to think that maybe we're like 1999 and not 1929 because it's like a tech-led bubble. And if it bursts, maybe for 2 or 3 years, equity values are down. One of the big changes that actually happened post-financial crisis 2008 that could come back to bite us is we regulated the banks quite heavily. And as a result, most loans in the U.S. and, by the way, parts of the rest of the world are now not really through banks at all anymore. They're through what's called the shadow banking system. Most people get a loan from what's called a private credit fund. And there is no disclosure required. We have no idea really how much leverage is in that system. We don't know how connected it is to other businesses, to the banking system, to anything else. And so to me, the sort of black swan event is not just that you have a crack in the market, but you actually have a crack in this sort of private credit business, and that you learn all of a sudden that there's so much more leverage and people who took out enormous loans, businesses that took out loans and the like, that can't be paid back. And then you throw one other piece on the fire that we haven't even talked about, the amount of debt that the governments now have, which is to say back in 1929, there was a budget surplus. The U.S. had hardly any debt. Germany had a lot of debt, but the U.S. was not the problem. Today, the amount of debt that all of these countries has is enormous. And if you do believe that the answer to every financial crisis is throwing money at the problem, as politically unpalatable as that may sound, it may be more unpalatable to bond investors and to sort of the investor class that may say, we're not buying these treasuries anymore. We're not buying sovereign bonds, or we're doing it, but we're going to charge you extraordinary amounts, and then you get into this whole situation of austerity and these sort of vicious cycles.
And that then just finally maybe brings us to you, if I could, and your job, because I am curious when you talk about something like that, the government debt crisis. Any bubble is something that can't really be predicted, but you need those people who are trying to warn, trying to turn the tide. Do you see that in yourself as well as a financial journalist? Is that part of how you envision your role? Is that something that can be different today than in past crises, that we have people trying to warn us?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I will say that after the 2008 financial crisis, this is very personally, I felt that, journalists were blamed oftentimes. People were upset with the journalists. They said that we did not blow the whistle loud enough. And by default, since the crisis happened, perhaps we didn't. And I would suggest if you go back and look at all the writings, I think we're trying to blow the whistle pretty loudly, but people didn't want to focus on that whistle. And it's true when the music – Chuck Prince, who ran Citigroup, used to say when the music's playing, you have to dance. And I think that's part of the problem. I found more recently, the more I have been cautionary, the more I've received feedback from readers and viewers and the like, that it's almost paternalistic. And they say, stop trying to protect me, Andrew. And by the way, they say, you're not trying to protect me. You're really protecting the man by sort of being almost paternalistic about these things. So I don't know. I also am very cognizant that being the Cassandra and being right is very difficult. So Charles Merrill of Merrill Lynch, he founded Merrill Lynch in 1928. He came out and told his clients to get out of the market. Between 1928 and September of 1929, the stock market went up 90%. You can be directionally right, but totally wrong on the timing. So I think in terms of my own role, I should be raising the questions, throwing the flags, but not necessarily offering financial advice.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was The Big Interview. Thanks very much to Andrew Ross Sorkin. It was produced by Steph Chongu. Check out our entire roster of big interviews on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Chris Cermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.